Hello everyone, and thank you for taking the time to attend my research presentation today. My name is Daisy Baldwin, and I am a PhD candidate and a lecturer at Memorial University Faculty of Nursing. Today I will be presenting my current research. It's a grounded theory study, and it's entitled, "What are the experiences of women who had gestational diabetes and are at risk for or go on to develop coronary artery disease?" And you can see I have listed my committee members, part of my PhD committee and research team below. So women have both traditional and non-traditional risk factors for coronary artery disease, and the literature does show that many women do not perceive the risk for coronary artery disease or believe that coronary artery disease is the leading cause of death in women. For example, there was a study by Cushman that was conducted in 2021, and they compared the findings of two National Heart Association surveys. One was conducted in 2009 and the other in 2019. And they found that women's knowledge that coronary artery disease is the leading cause of mortality declined from 65% of women in 2009 to 44% in 2019. So that's quite a knowledge drop. And women ages 25 to 35 had the greatest decrease in their knowledge. So these findings do highlight the need for action to increase knowledge of coronary artery disease in young women. Furthermore, gestational diabetes mellitus poses the greatest risk for future coronary artery disease in women in comparison to other non-traditional risk factors. And gestational diabetes is on the rise worldwide and nationally. Literature shows that there is a link between gestational diabetes and future coronary artery disease in women. A review by Bellamy that was conducted in 2009 was based on 20 cohort studies. They had over 675,000 women participate in this study, and they found that women with gestational diabetes mellitus were 7.43 times more likely to develop type 2 diabetes than women without gestational diabetes mellitus. And that particular risk factor is one that I feel as nurses we are quite aware of. However, the risk for coronary artery disease in women post-gestational diabetes mellitus exists whether they go on to develop type 2 diabetes or not. And literature also shows that women with gestational diabetes mellitus, regardless of developing type 2 diabetes, still had a 56% higher risk of developing coronary artery disease. Furthermore, these women were 2.31 times more likely to develop coronary artery disease within the first 10 years postpartum. Based on these findings, gestational diabetes mellitus is associated with future disease later in life, and the increasing rates of gestational diabetes mellitus means more women are exposed to the risk for these diseases. This is particularly concerning, considering coronary artery disease is the leading cause of mortality in women. So considering the negative impacts of coronary artery disease and the increasing rates associated with gestational diabetes mellitus, women with gestational diabetes mellitus compose an at-risk population for coronary artery disease, and hence a potential opportunity for early risk factor surveillance and modification. So follow-up for women with gestational diabetes mellitus has been recommended in both American and Canadian guidelines. And these recommendations suggest that women should adopt appropriate lifestyle changes to reduce the risk of coronary artery disease. And these recommendations include formalized postpartum follow-up, screening, physical exams, and education on lifestyle modifications. So we looked at a little overview of the literature. Now I want to go into the barriers So there is evidence that indicates that lack of follow-up for coronary artery disease post-gestational diabetes mellitus is attributed to the fact that women are not getting appropriate information from healthcare professionals. There are existing barriers to follow-up in postpartum women who had gestational diabetes mellitus, and there are issues related to women's health beliefs surrounding knowledge and risk perceptions of gestational diabetes mellitus. Firstly, women are not getting the appropriate information from healthcare professionals. The literature is telling us that, and they're not satisfied with the health information that they're receiving. For example, the results of one systematic review by Craig, which was conducted in 2020, composed of 41 high to medium quality studies and 3 qualitative descriptive studies, shared the common finding that communication during the post-gestational diabetes mellitus period with healthcare professionals was poor. This finding was in terms of the knowledge they received on lifestyle changes and the level and quality of information they received. A second barrier to follow-up in women are differing views of healthcare professionals who follow women with gestational diabetes postpartum and low screening uptake in women. While there was limited literature on healthcare professionals' views of follow-up in women with gestational diabetes mellitus, there were 2 studies. There was a cross-sectional study by Wu 2022 and a descriptive qualitative study by Tim 2021 that found that healthcare professionals who follow women postpartum or post-gestational diabetes mellitus have differing views on how follow-up should be. So in terms of screening uptake, the literature shows that low screening uptake in women with gestational diabetes mellitus was due to lack of time and childcare, like with a new baby, and women felt healthy postpartum and did not see the need for follow-up because they felt like they were back to themselves. Thirdly, there are issues related to women's health beliefs surrounding their knowledge of gestational diabetes mellitus and perceptions of risk post-gestational diabetes mellitus. Women have knowledge deficits surrounding gestational diabetes mellitus and do not associate a diagnosis of gestational diabetes mellitus with complications later in life. Women often refer to the birth of their child as the moment of truth, when gestational diabetes ends and life goes back to normal. And gestational diabetes mellitus is seen to be something that's temporary and does not last forever. And now that we looked at an overview of the literature and barriers in the literature, we're now going to take a look at the gaps. So the written recommendation set out by Diabetes Canada for follow-up in postpartum women with gestational diabetes mellitus does not contain specific recommendations on what or when women with gestational diabetes should be screened or assessed for coronary artery disease. So even though we talked about those recommendations earlier on, we don't have any information that contains specific recommendations or when this should occur. And there is some existing research evidence to show how women diagnosed with coronary artery disease cope, but there's none out there specifically on how women who had gestational diabetes mellitus and go on to develop coronary artery disease cope. As well, to my knowledge, there have been no interventional studies conducted to mitigate the risk of coronary artery disease post-gestational diabetes mellitus. And qualitative literature exploring women's experiences with gestational diabetes mellitus and awareness of coronary artery disease post-gestational diabetes is very limited. Most of the literature surrounding gestational diabetes mellitus is based on women's perceptions of their risk for type 2 diabetes and not coronary artery disease. There's also a lack of Canadian research on gestational diabetes mellitus and coronary artery disease in general, and to date, there have been no studies conducted in Newfoundland and Labrador on gestational diabetes mellitus and coronary artery disease, despite the high rates of coronary artery disease in the province. So now into the research problem. Based on the findings of the literature review, there is a need for intervention in women with gestational diabetes mellitus to help mitigate the development of coronary artery disease, since it is evident that this non-traditional risk factor for coronary artery disease exists. Therefore, making these women a target group for preventive strategies and early screening is warranted, since preventing the onset of coronary artery disease is far better than dealing with the impacts. However, due to the limited research literature surrounding gestational diabetes and coronary artery disease, more insight into the process by which women with gestational diabetes mellitus learn about their risk for coronary artery disease is needed to contribute to the development of an effective intervention that addresses this issue. The overall goal of this ongoing research study is to gain a fuller understanding of the psychosocial process that unfolds as women who are diagnosed with gestational diabetes mellitus come to understand and cope with their risk for and subsequent management of coronary artery disease. This includes how women awaken to the notion that they are at risk for coronary artery disease, how they come to understand and manage their risk for coronary artery disease, and how they live with coronary artery disease. The research questions for this study are: how do women living in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador diagnosed with gestational diabetes mellitus come to understand their risks for coronary artery disease? And secondly, how do women living in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador diagnosed with gestational diabetes mellitus and subsequently develop coronary artery disease experience this phenomena? So to answer these research questions, a grounded theory approach, as outlined by Glaser and Strauss, 1967, will guide this study and has been. A grounded theory methodology explores a psychosocial process of patterns or behaviors and activities that influence a phenomena of interest. In this study, the psychosocial process of interest is the experiences of Newfoundland and Labrador women who have been diagnosed with gestational diabetes mellitus as they awaken to the idea that they are at risk for coronary artery disease, how they understand and manage this risk, and how they live with coronary artery disease within the nexus of their social relationships. Grounded theory is an appropriate methodological approach for this study, being that it aims to discover and understand a psychosocial process as it unfolds. The data collection and analysis actually began in May for this study, and it's getting close to completion. This inductive approach is allowing a substantive theory to emerge from the data that we have collected. And using this methodology, I have remained objective throughout the research process. The substantive theory explains a pattern of behavior or a psychosocial process that is how women who were diagnosed with gestational diabetes mellitus awaken to the notion that they are at risk for coronary artery disease, how they come to understand and manage their risk for coronary artery disease, and how they live with coronary artery disease. And this theory will then be used to help healthcare professionals to develop interventions to address the unique needs of this cohort. For example, the creation of targeted health promotion initiatives, screening guidelines, and sex and gender specific cardiac rehabilitation programs. This study has the potential to inform how nurses provide care to women who are at risk for or living with coronary artery disease within this province in an effort to reduce the negative health outcomes linked with coronary artery disease. Prior to getting into my research, I did have to obtain ethics approval. So I got HREB approval first, and then I went through and got regional health authority approval from the regional health authorities across Newfoundland and Labrador. Theoretical sampling has been used to obtain participants for this study. Theoretical sampling is a type of purposeful sampling wherein the researcher chooses participants based on the experiences with the psychosocial process being investigated, and as emerging findings identify the need for participants. So in this case, we have recruited women diagnosed with gestational diabetes mellitus who are at risk for or they developed coronary artery disease. And the theoretical sampling has been happening simultaneously with our data collection, coding, and analysis. And in grounded theory, sample selection size is not predetermined, but it continues until you meet data saturation and no new theoretical categories emerge. And I'll talk a little bit about that a little later on. We feel that we are reaching data saturation in this study, and we have obtained over 20 participants thus far. Inclusion criteria for participants in this study included women who have been diagnosed with gestational diabetes mellitus and are at risk for or developed coronary artery disease. They had to be able to communicate in English, over the age of 18, living in Newfoundland and Labrador, mentally competent, and able to understand the purpose of the study. So recruitment for this study was really done through diverse methods. Healthcare physicians, cardiologists, and nurse practitioners across the province have been contacted to discuss the study and its purpose. And these healthcare providers were asked to inform their patients about the study via word of mouth. And we did get some recruitment through this particular recruitment method. We did put posters up. We placed them throughout physicians' offices, nurse practitioners' offices, women health clinics, cardiologist offices, and community health centers throughout Newfoundland and Labrador, with information regarding the project and the research team contact information. And an electronic form of the poster was also made available to circulate to primary care physicians and nurse practitioners province-wide. We did place a poster on physician and parent group websites and social media platforms, and we asked permission prior to actually placing these posters. Media, I really want to talk about this one because it certainly played a huge role in recruitment for this particular study. We created a PSA, and it was put throughout Stingray Radio province-wide with the description of the study and the contact information of the team. And this method of recruitment was by far the most successful to date. It certainly helped with recruitment. We got quite a few people who were interested in the study based on using media as a recruitment strategy. So if you are going into research and you are having some issues with recruitment, I highly recommend media. And finally, snowball sampling was used, where existing research participants could recruit other participants that they felt were eligible for the study via word of mouth. So data collection and analysis for this study is ongoing, and keeping with grounded theory, the constant comparative method is being utilized, where data collection and analysis happen simultaneously. The process of constant comparative method begins and ends by comparing components of each interview with those of every other interview. And participants have been invited to engage in semi-structured interviews with myself and my PhD supervisor, Dr. April Pike. Each interview lasts approximately 60 minutes at a time and have been offered through WebEx or in person, and interviews have been audio taped. Audio files have been transcribed verbatim by a transcriptionist, and for data analysis, Dr. Pike and I code each interview separately, and then we come together to discuss the findings and assign final codes. Both substantive and theoretical coding is being used, and substantive coding in grounded theory includes open and selective coding. So open coding really just starts by that basic line-by-line coding of the transcript to ensure that all the data is covered. And to facilitate the processes, we created tables and they had columns with data, codes, and theoretical memoing. And this was just a first step we used. And then similarities among the codes or conceptual labels have been collapsed into properties, which will then be combined into conceptual categories. And the goal of substantive coding is for the researcher to form as many of these categories that fit the data. So this means that we allow the categories to form without making preconceived notions of what we think they should be. And this is one way that you remain objective as a researcher in the grounded theory process. And as this coding continues, selective coding for the core variable starts as the categories begin to become saturated. So then the core variable becomes quite evident, and we are starting to see that now. And the core variable is central to the psychosocial process. It should occur frequently and across all categories. The second part of coding is then theoretical coding. So this occurs when theoretical links between the categories are made and the core variable is well established at that point. Theoretical constructs piece the information that were sorted into conceptual categories back together, and it helps to identify the psychosocial process or pattern or behavior in women diagnosed with gestational diabetes who are at risk for or go on to develop coronary artery disease to form a substantive theory. So in terms of ethical considerations, written informed consent has been obtained prior to commencing interviews. Participants were informed of any risks and benefits of the study and that participation is voluntary. We strive to always maintain confidentiality for participants. The audio files are destroyed once transcribed, and the transcriptions were de-identified immediately, and each participant was given a unique code. Everything is locked up. Transcripts are uploaded to an encrypted, password-protected computer, and data will be stored for 5 years, in which we will then destroy it. I have been so fortunate in obtaining funding to really be able to conduct this research study in the way that I hoped it could be conducted. And I have received funding through 3 funding agencies. So Memorial University's Seed Bridge Multidisciplinary Fund, I got $10,000 for my research there. It was awarded last October. I got Memorial University Public Engagement Quick Start funding, $2,500, which has allowed me to make many collaborations with healthcare professionals who are going to play a major part in my research throughout the regional health authorities of Newfoundland and Labrador. And I have also received AR Kazan funding of $2,000, which has actually allowed me to recently go to Goose Bay, Labrador to recruit and do some data collection for this particular study. So I'm very thankful for my funding. Well, this concludes my presentation for today, and I just want to thank you so much for coming today to learn a little bit more about my research, and it gave me the opportunity to talk about my research and what I have done thus far. I hope to finish up my data collection and analysis by the end of December, early New Year, and then get into the writing of my PhD dissertation. So I hope to come back in the future to talk about the findings of my study, and I hope to take these findings and to really make some differences for women who have had gestational diabetes mellitus in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, and hopefully help to mitigate the development of coronary artery disease in this population. If you have any questions, please see my email there on the slide, daisy.baldwin@mon.ca.